400,000 years ago, this was what the human species who reigned over Europe and Asia looked like. Their exceptional hunting skills helped them overcome some of the most savage prehistoric beasts. Adaptable to even the most hostile conditions, they left their mark everywhere, from the coasts of Spain to the Siberian mountains. These were the Neanderthals. The last traces of these extraordinary hunter-gatherers date back 4,000 years. So, what happened? For the last 150 years, scientists from around the world have been trying to get to the bottom of this mystery. They continue tirelessly to excavate sites in an attempt to retrace the history of the Neanderthal. Why did they disappear? Were they victim of climate change or of a devastating epidemic? Were they wiped out by other humans or preyed on by a formidable predator? Who or what were the culprits? All sorts of theories as to why Neanderthals disappeared have been put forward. There's an extraordinary ongoing exploration into the history of human life. It's a dazzling journey back in time, trying to get to the origins of our roots and the up of our genes. It's an unprecedented investigation of the prehistoric era that will allow us to get to the truth. Who killed the Neanderthals? Researchers have been excavating sites in forests, along cliffs, under rock shelters, and in caves to try to solve the mystery. These men and women are on the trail of this extinct species. They've been examining clue after clue, analyzing the tiniest trace and the slightest piece of evidence. Neanderthals lived in Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia from 400,000 years ago to 40,000 years ago, before becoming totally extinct. Were they our ancestors, our cousins, monsters? What did they look like? In 1856, the very first fossil was discovered in Germany, in a wooded area called the Neander Valley, giving rise to the most whimsical of interpretations. In the middle of the 19th century, 3 years before Darwin's Origin of the Species was published, it was inconceivable that humans might have had an ancestor. At the time of the discovery of the Neanderthals, there was a sort of taboo. The idea that a different species of human could have existed was hard for many scientists to accept, simply because no other humans had been recorded in fossil collections. So just who could this human have been? With its elongated cranium and protuberant eyebrows. For many experts in the 19th century, it was merely the dorse of a Cossack returning from the Russian wars. The proof was in the numerous bone fractures, which supposedly caused his death. There is an amusing story about the experts who imagined that the shape of the skull was due to the extreme pain the man had had to endure. This pain had made him constantly tense his face muscles, causing not only the elongated cranium, but the sizable protuberance above his eyes as well. But in the second half of the 19th century, other bone remains similar to those of this first discovery were found in other countries. In total, archaeologists dug up over 270 fossils across more than 130 sites. The scientists were no longer in doubt. They had before them the remains of another human species. But what was it? In 1908, Marcelin Boule, who founded the Institute of Human Paleontology in Paris, examined one of the first Neanderthal skeletons found in France, at La Chapelle. His results were unsettling. They showed a certain number of deformities, a curved spine, and bandy legs similar to those of gorillas. Based on these findings, the Czech illustrator Kapka drew an aggressive-looking ape-like creature covered in hair.
At the time, they didn't have enough information about prehistoric human behavior, so they had to make drawings.
And most of those that have remained are in fact the most ludicrous caricatures these prehistoric humans, often compared to animals or to monsters, were seen as primitive beings. They were like something from another world, conjuring up images of humans that were nothing like present-day humans. They were obviously something very unusual, bestial, archaic, and primitive. They were all sorts of pictures was created of bizarre, disc-shaped creatures, and this image of them as savage brutes would stick around for a long time. Were they ape-like creatures, or humans crippled by spine-deforming diseases? Were Neanderthals really the beasts depicted by the first anthropologists? How can we find out who they really were? Today, cutting-edge tools have enabled scientists to entirely reconstruct their physical appearance. Each object is carefully dug up, numbered, and analyzed in order to come up with the most realistic composite image possible of the victim. So, what did Neanderthals really look like? Using the remains of individual number 2 found in Spy Cave in Belgium, researchers at the Royal Institute of Natural Science have been working to create a 3D model of a Neander skeleton. Patrick Sammel and Tara Chapman lead the team, whose first task is to produce high-resolution scans. But there was a major problem. The skeleton was incomplete. There were bits of certain bones missing, and the rib cage and the pelvic bone had gone forever. The femur, for example, is almost complete, but it's missing a very small part of the top on the right bone. But on the left bone, it's missing the lower half. And how you do this is you put small points on the bones, which we call L marks, and then you put the same points on both bones, the original bone and the other, the bone you want to scale to. And then what I was able to do is, once they were similar, is then I could cut the bottom half of the right femur, scale to the left, and join them together. And then you have a complete bone. This is called the mirror technique, reconstituting missing parts by using those from the opposite side. When a whole set of bones is missing, Tara Chapman's team call upon laboratories from other countries to help them solve the puzzle. So here, the rib cage and pelvis have come from Neander remains in Kibara in Israel. Once these fossils have been modeled, they're scaled to the rest of the skeleton using statistical calculations based on the proportional sizes of existing bones. Once we did that, we then took the small fragment of the animal and we measured it against the new Karatu size, and we found that it fitted quite well. So for that, we could say, okay. And then we took the thorax and we scaled that to the size of the Karatu pelvis as well. This is the most precise modeling of Neanderthals ever to be produced. The caricatures have long since gone. Thanks to this highly realistic reconstitution, an anatomical analysis of Neanderthals' features is now possible. Will this help us to find out the cause of their extinction? So, the cranial cavity is on average more or less the same volume as ours today, but the architecture is completely different from ours. The cranium is elongated, fairly flat and wide. It has a protuberant face with a broad protruding nose. One distinguishing feature, a low receding forehead with a very pronounced supraorbital ridge. So the face was quite different from ours, especially as there was practically no chin under the lower jawbone. Could this physique, which was so different from ours, have been a handicap in their attempts to survive a hostile and brutal environment?
These specimens were fairly sturdy, with an average estimated height of 160 centimeters. The skeleton indicated that they had a wide barrel-shaped torso with powerful hands and feet. Their short legs and small stature made them exceptional wrestlers, ready for any sort of fight. The Neanderthals had a very sturdy
Physique with highly prominent joints indicating substantial muscular development. They were extremely athletic individuals who could run long distances. The Neanderthals had no physical weaknesses that would have brought about their extinction. But the scientists' work didn't stop there. They wanted to find out how Neanderthals walked. Was Marcel Boule right? Did they walk like gorillas? By simulating the muscle movement on the bones of the virtual skeleton, and by analyzing the wear in and tear on the joints, they were able to reproduce the Neanderthal walk in the biomechanics lab of the University Libre of Belgium. Tara Chapman has been working with Dr. Svan and Jan in reconstituting the way our protagonists walked. By placing markers in the exact same places on a modern-day Homo sapiens and on a virtual Neander skeleton, they're able to compare the prehistoric way of walking with ours. We were able to make the bones move in space and then analyze the bones one after another, for example while walking or during a whole series of movements like throwing a javelin, crouching, running, and so on. Neanderthals have a very similar morphology to ours, and when comparing the motion curves of prehistoric humans to modern-day humans, there's no difference. London Thales certainly didn't walk in the ape-like manner that was associated with them in the past, simply because joints were totally consistent with their own joints. So, from a joint and bone structure point of view, there's absolutely no reason to believe that they walked like apes. The idea that Neanderthals were closer to gorillas than humans is no longer tenable. They ran and walked just like us. So what was their figure like, their physical appearance? Thanks to the analysis of their muscle mass and the reconstitution techniques, it's possible to simulate a Neander body. Can their muscles, skin color, body hair, and iron hair color all be worked out? In the Max Planck Institute of Human Evolution in Leipzig, Jean-Jacques Jan's team are trying to identify the exact color and texture of our ancestors. One of the fundamental characteristics of the human species is having very little body hair, since it's connected to their ability to sweat. It's related to the hunting methods of the first Homo mogenes in Africa, who were able to hunt their prey even during the hottest parts of the day. This is not what other predators who were more nocturnal used to do. Homo mogenes lost its covering of body hair 1.7 million years ago. When the Neanderthals appeared 400,000 years ago, they were not furry creatures covered in hair. Their anthropometric profile is becoming clearer. Skin color is something that varies considerably in humans. Every time a population moves away from a sunny region, an area where there is lots of ultraviolet light, towards a region where there is less light, it results in a loss of pigmentation. Neanderthals lived in northern latitudes, where light was scarce, and they would have had fair skin which helps capture the sunlight and manufacture vitamin D, vital for bone strength. When the scientists at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig analyzed the Neanderthal DNA, they found the skin and hair colors to be within the same palette as that of modern Europeans. These archaic humans had pale or tan skin, dark blonde or red hair with hazel or lighter colored eyes. We now have a composite portrait of our victim. The Neanderthals were sturdy individuals with powerful muscles, measuring around 160 centimeters and weighing 75 kilos. They were not weak and feeble. Their brains were as large as ours, and they walked just like we do. They weren't prone to any particular disease nor physical disability.
The Neanderthals were prehistoric athletes whose physique was well adapted to their environment, both in terms of climate and also geographically. If these humans were so well adapted to their environment, who were their ancestors? To answer this, we need to delve into the Neander memory to browse the great book of the origins of humanity.
And to go back in time, in the Arago cave in the eastern Pyrenees, scientists discovered the cranium of the oldest known inhabitant of France. He lived on this planet more than 600,000 years ago and belonged to a subspecies called Twellman. Researchers called him the European Homo heidelbergensis. The skull dates back 450,000 years and belonged to a young adult in his 20s. Could Twellman have been the ancestor to the Neanderthals? The bone analysis throws up numerous clues. The cranium was flat with a receding forehead, a powerful supraorbital ridge with a hollow right above the nose and no chin. So in many ways, he resembles his direct descendant, the Neanderthal. But there are important differences in characteristics between the two. The young man discovered at Tovel has the same anatomical characteristics as our victim. Twellman was a taller, thinner species with a smaller brain. They weren't Neanderthals, but would evolve into them for thousands of years. There was a succession of ice ages and warmer periods which isolated Homo heidelbergensis, confining them to Europe. Their bodies adapted to their environment, becoming stronger and stockier, and the size of their brains increased over the generations. Twellman became Neanderthal. Twellman were Neanderthals' ancestors and passed on their history, a history which has become that of the Neanderthals. And it's a history which goes right back to the origins of humanity in Africa over 1 million years ago. The European Neanderthals descended from a population called Homo heidelbergensis. This population also existed in Africa. The Homo heidelbergensis who stayed in Africa became Homo sapiens. The European Homo heidelbergensis became Neanderthals. But those in Africa became Homo sapiens. Neanderthals have the same parents as us, Homo heidelbergensis, or evolved Homo erectus. Neanderthals are our human brothers and sisters. 1 million years ago, our common ancestors lived on the African continent. Around 600,000 years ago, the family divided in two. Our direct hands ancestors stayed in Africa, whereas the ancestors of the Neanderthals crossed into the Middle East and settled in Europe. Traces of them have been found in Germany, in Cima de Azulas in Spain, and in the Arago cave. Twellman seemed to be able to adapt to climate change, but was there a major upheaval which was the cause of their extinction? To find out more, it's important to know exactly when they became extinct. By dating the bone remains and comparing the data with the climate history of Europe. At the Oxford University Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit, Ada Katarina Dua has managed to determine the death of Neanderthals. In order to accurately date the latest Neanderthals, we visited several sites across Europe and collected material from Spain, France, several sites in Italy, Greece, and of course Northern Europe, where we know Neanderthals used to live. In this Oxford University lab, researchers have developed a whole new technique for dating bone fossil remains. To avoid contamination, the samples are filtered so that only the carbon-14 in fossils is analyzed. This is known as ultrafiltration. We didn't know what to expect because the results were coming one by one, and for years, as we would date one site, we date another.
But it was only when we put all the synthesis together that things became quite clear. There were no sites all across Europe that would post-date the 39,000 years ago. We were very excited when we eventually, for the first time, we got a reliable date for the extinction of Neanderthals 39,000 years ago. The disappearance of the Neanderthals came much earlier than previously imagined. Scientists now want to find out what the weather in Europe was like at the time. Was the climate temperate, or was there a severe ice age?
In fact, the climate was very unstable during that period. There were a whole series of climate crises which we call Hinrich events. They are fairly ferocious episodes linked to ice flowing into the oceans in the northern hemisphere. For over a century, icebergs flowed relentlessly all the way to the coasts of Spain. These mountains of ice considerably cooled down the climate in Europe of 40,000 years ago. Scientists call this climate event Hinrich IV. It's important to understand that these environmental and climate crises happen constantly over 400,000 years, and the Neanderthals would have experienced them all. And yet they weren't wiped out. What is true is that the coldest episodes would have had an impact on the size of Neanderthal populations in general. The different climatic upheavals weakened the Neanderthals by reducing the extent of their territory and making food resources scarce. But these 30 individuals were nevertheless able to survive and continue to exist on the planet. If the extinction of the Neanderthals can't be explained by the climate, perhaps their way of life was the cause. Were their know-how and their technologies good enough to resist a prehistoric era? What did their habitat, stretching from Giar to Mount Alai in Siberia and from Germany to the south of Italy, look like? How and on what did they live? Did they regularly change camp according to the seasons and the movements of the animals they hunted? The Neanderthals were very careful where they pitched camp. Cave entrances, meadows overlooking valleys, or riversides were all examples of well-chosen places to settle. Dominic C. and his team found a most unexpectedly rich site beneath the dunes of the large beaches of the Khotan Peninsula. Under the sands of Luel, they discovered 20 meters of an extremely well-preserved domestic habitat. The valuable traces left behind have presented the archaeologists with a true photo of Neanderthal daily life. What is interesting about this site is that there are levels of occupation that have been regularly covered by sand, blown in by the wind. So we have snapshots, relatively brief moments of life frozen in time, and then covered over again by sand. The site shows us a degree of social organization with the distribution of tasks across the members of the tribe. The archaeologists were able to define the different zones dedicated to preparing hides, cutting meat, and cooking. Here we can see a hearth where Neanderthals cook their food. A clan made up of a dozen members regularly came to these dunes from autumn through to spring. In Luel, the sand has preserved unique traces of their presence, footprints. The researchers found more than 500 of them. In all, we found one, then a second, then we found several. Some of them we found were so clearly imprinted, impacted into the ground with the toe marks still visible. It looked like someone had walked into a barely dry puddle of mud. It was absolutely clear what we were looking at. A storm had broken over the tribe, and their living space was covered over with silt. And it's in this mud that our Neanderthals left their mark. Once the storm had passed, a strong wind blew a thick layer of dry sand over the footprints in the silt.
thus preserving the traces of Neanderthals for 80,000 years. This footprint demonstrates that a Neanderthal had tried to sidestep an obstacle. The foot is more heavily imprinted into the mud, which splashed up on both sides of the foot. The image is of a dynamic Neanderthal scrambling up the edges of the sand dune. Here, a Neanderthal had crouched down and then used his hand to get up, leaving an imprint of fingers and palm for posterity. Neanderthals lived on this coastline in clans composed of parents and children 80,000 years ago. And what is really poignant is that we found numerous children's footprints. 2 small baby feet and those of a 1-year-old. Over one particular area of 80 square meters. Dominic's team found only imprints from children's feet, as if it had been a play area just next to the place where the adults were busy with daily survival activities. Almost like a kindergarten, where the youngsters
played while the adults looked on approvingly. We could imagine their daily life, especially when we found trails of footprints. It was as if Neanderthals had just passed by. We almost turned around to check that they weren't actually behind us. Just like the sand castles that we all built when we were children, this site is fragile. It only takes a drop of rain or a sea breeze, and these ephemeral traces of the past would disappear forever. What these well-organized camps tell us about the nomadic Neanderthals is that they lived here for as long as they could, depending on how much food they could get hold of. More evidence of daily Neanderthal life can be found elsewhere in Europe. At Marel, in the French Doul, researchers uncovered numerous traces of hearths, as can be witnessed by the redness of these burnt rocks and the white-colored ashes found in the layers of sediment. Fire played a crucial role in the human evolution of Neanderthals, vital for lighting, essential for keeping warm, used for cooking meat, and a formidable tool for keeping predators at bay. Neanderthals certainly knew how to make fires. Researchers have even worked out how Neanderthals went about producing fire. They used marcasite, which contains iron and sulfur, to produce sparks and satellite plant fibers. The striations left on some of the stone tools bear out this technique. The Neanderthals mastered fire better than any species before them, and used it as an indispensable ally in their survival. Other dig sites have come up with evidence enabling us to understand what and how a Neanderthal ate. Is it possible that they died out because of some dietary deficiency? What we were looking for is to find out what our victim, Amanda Henry, research scientist at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, has been analyzing Neanderthal dental calculus. This layer of plaque found on teeth and gums holds all sorts of unexpected information about what Neanderthals ate. What we're looking for inside the calculus are tiny residues of plants, usually either starch grain or phytoliths that form during the plant's lifetime and that can last over archaeological time spans. And what we're looking for is the shape and the size and some of the morphological features of these starch grains and phytoliths, in order to figure out what plant they came from. These vegetal remains showed that Neanderthals ate plants such as barley, tubers, water lutes, and even dates. But there was something else that Amanda Henry found out. We have found gelatinized or altered starches on a few of our Neanderthal dental calculus samples. And we think that's pretty strong evidence that Neanderthals were intentionally processing their food, some sort of cooking. So, Neanderthals didn't suffer from deficiencies in vitamins or mineral salts, since their diets were extremely varied. They even cooked plants to make them more edible. Nevertheless, the numerous bones found in dig sites indicate that Neanderthals must primarily have eaten meat. Scientists have been able to calculate how much energy they spent daily due to their powerful muscles and impressive body mass.
Neanderthals burnt around 6,000 calories a day, 3 times more than we do. They would have had to eat meat every day to satisfy their needs. Could famine, caused by a shortage of animals, have been the cause of their extinction? Marel Poum-Matisse is a researcher at the Institute of Human Paleontology in Paris and has studied animals from the Neanderthal era and how they were hunted. You can forget the naive, outdated image of the poor prehistoric man wandering around the frozen tundra. This is totally incorrect. Our studies have shown that there was a great range of animals, and plenty of them. Could be hunted, especially as most of the prey were in flocks or herds. Finding food was not a problem. Did the Neanderthals just salvage dead animals, or were they skilled hunters? At Lauracelle, Dominique Codot uncovered a strange carcass. We were fortunate to come across a fragment of the jawbone of a walrus. It was almost certainly an animal that had drifted down on an ice floe and was probably dead when washed up on the shore. The meat was probably scavenged, although I don't really like the expression because it's associated with meat that's been left out for a while.
And anyway, the Undertales were like us. When they ate meat, they ate perfectly edible meat. And carrying meat can be dangerous. It has to be kept away from other carnivores, such as vultures and hyenas. Researchers have also found out that a Neander menu contained both fish and shellfish. They made the most of all the natural resources they could lay their hands on for daily survival. They were knowledgeable about their environment. Even if Neanderthals took advantage of animals that were already dead, they still used hunting as their principal means of survival. By analyzing the geography of the sites of Central Europe, Marilyn Pattis worked out that knowledge of their environment enabled Neanders to choose suitable places like waterholes or the bottom of valleys to trap animals and prevent them from getting away. I studied a site at Starosky Shely in the Crimea, where Neanderthals had killed small endels in an enclosed valley. First, beaters drove them into the valley, and since it was enclosed, when they arrived at the edge of the valley, the hunters blocked their route and speared them with lances. Neanderthals used the range of well-worked strategies to hunt mammoths, bison, oro horses, ibex, and also smaller prey such as hares or groundhogs, depending on the season. Were they able to make sophisticated tools and weapons powerful and effective enough to kill their prey and skin them? What about tools to pick and gather fruit and vegetables, or to work on hides and furs? There's a great deal of evidence to show that Neanderthals were exceptional hunters, such as these carved stones, as sharp as knives, which litter the ground of their living areas. Scientists in Germany have even discovered other weapons in their armory, wooden spears whose points were hardened by fire. At the University of Ulm in the Paris region, Eric Buer is a prehistory technologist who has reconstituted the history of tools invented by humans. For him, Neander inventions were as good as any other technical inventions of major importance. Before they came along, humans shaped rocks block by block like sculpts. But Neanderthals were excellent artisans and invented a new revolutionary tool-making technique. It consisted of cutting stone to produce sharp-edged flakes. They already knew what they wanted from a block of stone. The tool they were making had 10 technical characteristics. But in theory, the block of stone wouldn't inherently have them. The Neanderthal man or woman would first prepare the block, giving it a certain shape, and this shape would contain the very specific technical characteristics in question. So, once the preparation had been done, they would strike the rock with one blow in the prepared place, and the flake that would be produced would have exactly the sharp edge required. This major new technique had a considerable advantage. It enabled several tools with identical characteristics to be reproduced quickly. This desire to reproduce the same flakes was connected not so much to a need for a particularly sharp tool, but more to the possibility of standardizing or normalizing the handheld part. In other words, handles could be created that would be adapted to these identical flakes. Neanderthals invented the assembling of objects. The heel shape of these flakes, like a peaked cap, is evidence of this. They knew how to attach carved stones onto a handle using animal tendons. In the Middle East, at the site of El in Syria, Eric Buer discovered another way Neanderthals attached tools and weapons, once again highlighting their ingenuity. We found 200 square meters of flakes remains, of camels, donkeys, and hunted game. So was clearly a normal camp when I picked up the first object. I noticed there was a mark on the ground. And exactly the same mark was also visible on the surface of the object that had been in contact with the ground. There were a few bits which came away, but I took these bits and I burnt some of them, and it seemed like we'd found bitumen on them. By mixing bitumen with sand and then cooling it down with water, the Neanderthals had found a substance as strong as cement, to glue things together using natural tar. In this way proves once again how inventive and intelligent this species was. The innovation spread all over the Mediterranean, right up into Germany, where Neanderthals used a plant-based glue made from birch sap. On the steep ledges of Mount Etus near Maine in the south of France, Neanderthals hunted ibex from the end of January right up to the spring. During an archaeological dig at this hunting spot, H. Dellum uncovered an apparently insignificant piece of evidence, which nevertheless proved that Neanderthals didn't just hunt for food. Daunton, in the remains, which date back 40 to 45,000 years, we found bones from the legs of panthers that connected up anatomically, but nothing else of the skeleton was found. This led us to believe that there must have been a panther skin with the ends of the pores still inside, used as a rug or as clothing. More than that, we couldn't say. The use of dead animal hides is backed up by the presence of dental wear and tear, particularly on the incisors. It's proof that teeth were used as a third hand. By holding the animal skin between the jaws, Neanderthals were able to pull it tight and work on it more easily. Masters of fire, revolutionary stonecutters, fearsome hunters, creative craftspeople. The picture of Neanderthal is becoming clearer. This great nomadic people clearly didn't become extinct through lack of know-how. So just how far did these tireless nomads travel? Working alongside Russian researchers, the scientists at Max Planck in Leipzig have perfected a new technique for uncovering DNA even when there are no human bone remains to excavate. Here in the Siberian caves, they're analyzing the sedimentary layers. This is a fantastic new opportunity for archaeology. DNA contained in sediment layers enables us to tell if humans were present at a dig site, but also to tell if Neanderthals were there first, and then if modern humans arrived afterwards, and perhaps the Neanderthals came back again after that. It's a technique which allows a better definition of the geographic zones covered by Neanderthals, and also perhaps to find out if they went even further east. At the risk of getting lost, the oldest identified Siberians were discovered in the Denisova caves and arrived there during a period of global warming, 120,000 years ago. At that time, glaciers only covered a very small section of the ice caps, and so whole populations could travel eastwards within Asia quite easily. There's a strong probability that the Neanderthals traveled to the easternmost territories beyond the Siberian mountains. Thanks to the techniques of sedimentary analysis, it's certainly possible to obtain DNA from open-air sites, and then we would have proof of the presence of Neanderthals in the Far East, in Mongolia or in China.
Neanderthals were completely at home in nature, and nothing suggests that their endless migrations led to their downfall. All the evidence gathered on the daily lives of Neanderthals shows that they must have been able to communicate amongst themselves, to devise hunting strategies, to pass down ancestral customs, to warn fellow travelers of potential dangers, or simply to express emotions. How can we be sure that they mastered the tools of language? The first clue came from the Kibara site in Israel. Archaeologists found a Neanderthal fossil that was almost completely intact, and with it the anatomical proof that Neanderthals were able to express themselves with language. This bone, situated in the upper larynx, is the hyoid bone, which helps to keep the base of the tongue in place and articulate sounds. A valuable piece of evidence which proves that Neanderthals could most likely talk.
All more evidence came to light thanks to the computer modeling of the cranium. Scientists were able to recreate the endocranium. In other words, the imprints of the brain. An endocranium is the somewhat magical image of something that doesn't get preserved in fossils. It's the brain. The brain leaves an imprint on the inner surface of the cranium, because during our growth and development, both brain and skull evolve at the same time. The brain presses on the cranium, and both are bound to each other as we grow. This cast of a Neanderthal brain imprint shows that they possess the same zones associated with language as modern-day humans. We're able to detect one by one the different areas of the brain. Here are the frontal lobes, the temporal lobes, and the occipital lobes. And the precision is such that we're able to observe smaller zones, the different convolutions, and the anatomical zones which are of a functional interest. Here we can see the extension of Broca's area, which is a zone linked to language production. For example, the third piece of evidence comes to us via genetics. In the Max Planck laboratories in Leipzig, scientists have identified the FOXP2 gene in the Neanderthal DNA. This gene is fundamental in the development of language in humans. So, Neanderthals could talk. Thanks to the power of words, Neanderthals were able to transmit their know-how to future generations, enabling their continued existence. So, if there's no material evidence in their daily life which suggests the cause of their extinction, could it have been to do with their relationship with others? What can the fossils tell us about the ties which bound the members of the tribe to each other? Up until death was a huge challenge for this prehistoric humans. Life was closely linked to death. Were they afraid of it? Did they see it as inevitable, or just as a passage to another world? In Siberia, a team of Russian archaeologists from the Institute of Nusaybin, led by Professors Kazankabova and B. Fola, have been carrying out digs since 2010 in the Chagits-Kayaga cave not far from the Ali Mountains. The scientists have made an extraordinary discovery, a first in this part of the world: more than 80 Neanderthal bone remains. We found a complete Neanderthal living space in the Chiskaya cave, where they left evidence of their daily lives. They hunted, carved stones, and made fires. The cave is not very big, and there were about 10 to 15 members in the clan. Some of the bone remains were found together in the same spot, at the cave's entrance. A vast majority of these bones came from the same individual. For example, there was a right arm with the shoulder blade, collarbone, humerus, ulna, and radius. It's almost certainly an intentional anthropogenic deposit. The arm is in its entirety and bears no traces of animal bites. So these are not the remains of a predator's meal. These bones were buried in the tomb. This was a clan burial from as far back as 50,000 years ago. However, nothing here indicated that there had been any particular ritual. Neanderthals buried their dead. The first Neanderthal tomb in France was discovered at La Champlain, near to Briard, in the southwest. Sheltered under the rocks, the deceased was buried in the fetal position, with the head facing the east. In other words, towards the rising sun. Other tombs have been discovered in the Middle East, showing more evidence of how much attention Neanderthals paid to their dead. The corpse was often decorated with objects placed there like offerings, plants, animal bones, carved stones, traces of ochre, or even shells. Proof that Neanderthals were empathetic. They had an ability to imagine another world, helping the dead to the life beyond. Numerous Neanderthal skulls dating back around 120,000 years were excavated at a remarkable site at Krapina in Croatia, at the Museum of Natural Science. In Zagreb, Jakov Rovic analyzed the various marks on the bones. The carefully drawn striations were symbols of a complex funeral rite. We observe several types of cranial striations in Shinaya. We can be absolutely certain that some of them are of human origin. I believe that these cranial striations were created intentionally and have a symbolic value. These marks had a geometrical shape, and they were meticulously drawn on the brow and on the head itself. Jakov Radovic believes that they were signs of a very special ritual that is often called a skull cult. The cranial bone was broken to enable the brain to be removed and most likely eaten. Striations almost certainly came about as a result of cannibalistic behavior, probably as a ritual asserting the particular relationship between the tribe and the dead person. So it was a cannibalistic funeral. The Krapina fossils are not an isolated case. Other signs of cannibalism have been found on other dig sites. At the Belgian Royal Institute of Natural Sciences, Ellen Reer has been examining fossils found in the Go caves at the end of the 19th century. She too observes similar traces on the bone remains. In the caves, we found a whole collection of Neanderthal bones from the rather piecemeal remains of at least 6 individuals. And the reason for this fragmentation was that the bones had been broken so that the marrow could be extracted. This was after the muscles and the skin had been removed and the body completely torn apart. These marks on the bones are a sign that the Neanderthal deliberately cut away the skin. Here we can see that the bone had been broken even though the person was already dead. And so it wasn't the burying of the bones which caused them to break. There are very visible impact marks made by a small rock. These signs are definite proof of cannibalistic practices. We found the same occurrences on Neanderthal bones as we found on reindeer and horses, and the marks were situated in exactly the same places and produced in the same way on the Neanderthals as on the animals. Was this cannibalism for food or for ritual? For the Go finds, the scientists cannot answer that question, but it's clear that cannibalistic practices have dangers for human health. So, could these practices have been the cause of the extinction of Neanderthals? In the middle of the 20th century, researchers were able to prove that populations who practice cannibalism could be wiped out. A terrifying disease called Kuru had killed off certain tribes in Papua New Guinea. A protein called prion is responsible for the fatal disease. This protein is found in the brain and in the bone marrow and is transmitted through eating those parts of the body. We found a great number of traces of repeated cannibalism in certain sites. So we wondered if they'd all developed the prion-type illness since they were cannibals,
especially as the protein is difficult to get rid of. In other words, if they used a tool to cut out a diseased brain and then used the same tool to cut up meat afterwards, then the disease could easily spread. Once the prion has been absorbed into the body, it attacks and destroys the nervous system, causing death. This might have been how Neanderthals died. The most important sites where cannibalism has been observed date back to between 100 and 800,000 years, so well before the Neanderthals became extinct. And the other problem is that Neanderthals were spread out over a huge area of Europe and parts of Eurasia. So we're talking about very disparate populations with different cultures. It's probably a bit of an exaggeration to say that all Neanderthals were cannibals. So death by prion was not the cause of the extinction of Neanderthals. It would have meant that every tribe was cannibalistic, but there's no archaeological proof of this. So, if the Neanderthal death customs were not responsible for their disappearance, perhaps we need to be looking at the birth side of things. Were there enough Neanderthals to guarantee the future of the species? Have their fossil remains kept any vestiges of their births? Did a low birth rate bring about the extinction of the Neanderthal people? In the genetic laboratories at Max Planck, researchers have managed to compare the DNA of several Neanderthal fossils. Basing their results on the number of fossils found and their genetic similarities, these paleodemographers are able to estimate the size of the Neanderthal population. The measure that we usually obtain from the analysis of sequence data is what we call the effective population size, and Neanderthals usually go in the low thousands or the
low 10,000s. The effective population size helps to measure the genetic diversity of Neanderthals. It seems it varied between 1,000 and 10,000 depending on the period studied. These variations in genetic diversity that can be detected in the DNA correspond exactly to the Earth's different climate periods. The tests show that the population of Neanderthals had a very low genetic diversity compared to other species. In other words, the DNA in each Neanderthal is very similar. But while analyzing this DNA, the scientists came across something else. So what we infer from the Neanderthals' genomes is a long-term decrease in their population. So genetic research definitely confirms the theory that there was a drop in the Neanderthal population over time, but the reasons for this still remain. In the Denisova cave in Sierra, more clues hidden in the DNA of the extinct species were uncovered. What's interesting at Denisova is that there was a very small group for a long time, but also there was an element of inbreeding, especially in the last generation. We can see that the parents of these individuals are very close genetically. They may have been grandparents and grandchildren, or an uncle and a niece. This consanguinity is an important piece of information, since they couldn't find any other partners. Neanderthals were forced to mate within their own clans, their own families, without an injection of genes from outside of the tribe. Is this how archaic humans sowed the seeds of their downfall? Did the very low genetic diversity of Neanderthal and the inbreeding of certain individuals bring about the degeneration of the population, and thus its extinction? This reduced diversity may, in some populations, be linked to inbreeding, which further decreases the diversity and increases the probability of recessive deleterious variations expressing themselves, and this may lead to a number of genetic disorders. Genetic disorders caused by malfunctioning genes produce negative effects on the organism. So what risks were these people running? Populations with low diversity have much more difficulty to face environmental challenges or genetic challenges that may come, for example, infections. infections linked to illnesses for which these humans would not have developed natural defense mechanisms. Genetics can go even further to explain the situation of the Neander populations of 40,000 years ago. Over time, there were fewer and fewer of them. Their genetic diversity declined. Cases of inbreeding have been discovered. Neanderthals found themselves less well equipped to fight diseases as well as the constant changes dictated by the nomadic way of life. Neanderthals, the victims at our crime scene, demonstrated a weakness in their DNA, in the very heart of their cells. To find out if this is a clue to their extinction, we need to look more carefully at their relationship to others. Did Neanderthals make the wrong type of friends? Were they wiped out during tribal conflicts, or did they fall victim to a disease carried by a third party? In the Osseorian hills in northern Spain, at the end of a long forest path, is a small passage leading deep underground. In the Cedron cave, Professors Marco de Sela and Antonio Roses brought to light an archaeological treasure. At the bottom of this deep chamber, 400 meters from the entrance, where a small river flows, these researchers discovered what looked like a mass grave of Neanderthals. In all, nearly 2,600 bones were excavated. What could have happened? Is this a proof of mass extermination? The Eledon assemblage is the largest Neanderthal bone assemblage ever found in the Iberian Peninsula, and we have identified a minimum number of 13 individuals, 7 adults, 3 adolescents, 2 juveniles, and 1 infant. Leah at the Citan site, what is both strange and surprising is that there were practically no animal remains found alongside those of the Neanderthals. Usually, the assemblage comes from different period. In this case, and because of the special condition of the site, we are in front of a single biological and social Neander group. This is quite special for this kind of site, and it makes Sion a very particular place. The DNA found in the remains of these 13 Neanderthals confirmed their biological relationship. These men, women, and children all belonged to the same family. Their bones were crushed and their skulls broken into small pieces. How can the sad fate of this tribe be explained? At the University of Madrid, Antonio Rosas analyzed these remains. What did the results show? What happened to the Citron tribe of 13 Neanderthals?
We have found different evidences to support the hypothesis of cannibalism. The clearest are the what we call cut marks. We found marks of cannibalism in adults and also in immature individuals.
Cannibalism? Again, the bones had been broken open for the marrow. Was this Neander clan devoured by bloodthirsty warriors? The carbon dating was to provide some answers. We have, the several methods for dating the assemblage. Actually, we got a very consistent dating, and the age is 49,000 years ago. This clan had been eaten 49,000 years ago by other Neanderthals. After the fatal feeding frenzy, a storm broke. The river that runs through the rocks carried away the remains of this cannibalistic feast into the depths of the cave, which is where the fossils of this tribe were discovered. Were the Citron 13 victims of intertribal conflict? Were they martyrs of a sacrificial rite, or a meal for another famine-affected clan? If Antonio Rosas can't come up with the answers, there are similar traces of violence elsewhere which could provide some explanations. In 1979, a Sans in Charente, Marim, in the west of France, the skull of a young Neanderthal female, nicknamed Piet, was found with a large gash on it. In the Middle East, other fossils have been found with serious injuries to the head and limbs. Are these a series of clues which point to the consequences of a bloody war? Were Neanderthals perhaps victims of what we call nowadays a genocide? Did they come into contact with another species of human? Who are these strange humans with flat faces, round heads, and elongated figures, with high rounded foreheads and faces ending in pointed chins, with long legs holding up slender bodies? They are Homo sapiens. So are they the prime suspects in this investigation? And if Neanderthals came into contact with them, what's their story? The versions which most closely resemble us come from Africa, 300,000 years ago. They were recently discovered in Jabal Irhoud in Morocco. While Neanderthals dominated Europe, Homo sapiens conquered huge areas of Africa, from the Indian Ocean all the way to the Atlantic coasts. And then, 120,000 years ago, a major climate event forced our ancestors to seek out new lands to inhabit. In the past, there were episodes called the periods of the wet Sahara. Instead of the Sahara that we know today, there were savannas, lakes, rivers, elephants, and giraffes, over a territory which was as big as the USA. The wet Sahara period of 120,000 years ago is possibly what explains the presence of modern-day humans outside of Africa, in the zone between the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and Syria. Homo sapiens, modern humans, migrated northwards in two different directions. The first route followed the Nile Delta up to Palestine, and then continued into the Jordan Valley. The second route took the Bab el-Mandeb straight towards the Arabian Peninsula and up to the Levant. So, Homo sapiens arrived in Neanderthal territory and settled in rock shelters such as the School and CF caves in Israel. For over 10,000 years, modern humans were forced to share this land with prehistoric men and women in the Tabun caves in Mount Carmel. How did this cohabitation work out? Anthropologists like to think in models. You know, we have models to explain what could have happened when two different groups meet each other. Either it's a love story, it's a massacre story, or one just simply give up and move to a new area. When faced with newcomers, hunter-gatherers reacted in one of three different ways the first encounters. The first involved brutal conflict. The tribes fought each other, and victory went to the stronger or the clever tribe. The second reaction was flight. The incumbents left their place to the newly arrived strangers. And lastly, there was exchange. The two sets of people interacted, communicated, and mixed together, culturally and genetically. I don't know if it was a Romeo and Juliet story in that sense, but what I can tell, as I said, from the fact that they were overlapping for such a long period of time, and the fact that they share the same technology, that they were communicating peacefully with one another, and probably interbred. In the Middle East, Neanderthals and sapiens exchanged their knowledge and interbred. These first encounters in Israel, dating back 120,000 years, were neither brutal nor belligerent. So what could the traces of violence found in France signify? Are they evidence of bloody battles between these two types of humans? Was their history in Europe different from elsewhere? Or did their paths just simply cross? To find this out, we have to work out exactly when Homo sapiens arrived in the Andal colonies. The first European sapiens left the Middle East and settled in Central Europe around 45,000 years ago. Later, around 42,000 years ago, another wave of Homo sapiens migration settled around the Mediterranean basin and began to inhabit almost the whole of the European area. 42,000 years ago, that's the date attributed to Pierrette, the Neanderthal female with a fatal head wound found at Sensilaire.
This clue could well prove that there had been a clash between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. Could we then infer that there was already such a thing as war in prehistoric times? The conditions of life at the time, the low population, the vast areas of land, the abundance of animals, the ample amount of food, and so on, all showed that there were no conditions that we're aware of that would have provoked violent outbreaks. So if there hadn't been any warlike clashes, what could the visible injury on the Saucis fossil mean? When there's a mark of a blow to the head, a single blow, it's impossible to know if this blow was deliberately by someone else or if it came perhaps from a hunting accident. There's also the possibility, and it occurs from time to time, of it being interpersonal violence, but then it's just between two people and doesn't constitute a massacre. Sporadic clashes took place between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, but the evidence of the first mass conflicts date back to the Neolithic era, that's to say between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago, which is well after Neanderthals died out. Pierret's cranial injury is only a reflection of the difficult living conditions of archaic humans. The genocide theory, that is, the deliberate annihilation of the Neanderthals by sapiens, doesn't hold up. Hunting accident, fall, interpersonal violence, there were many causes of injury and death in prehistoric times. Nevertheless, analysis has shown that certain bone wounds healed and recovered. It would seem that these injured men and women survived and got better through luck or know-how. Did Neanderthals know how to look after their loved ones? Did they know anything about treating their sick, or did they abandon them? At the Natural History Museum in Zagreb, one particular skull amongst those excavated at Cana displays some fascinating signs of having healed. Neanders suffered from a lot of various kinds of injuries. That was a normal part of their life. Certain injuries were very dangerous. From this injury, we know that the person was even in coma, the person even in this really serious medical problem, survived long enough that we see the healing process. So that means some kind of care of the community that this person was a part of. And there's another case which the Croatian scientists got excited about. An arm amputated from below the elbow showed signs that the muscles hadn't actually got weaker. The Neanderthal's arm had not only healed after this terrible injury, but it had almost recovered full use. It had obviously been treated, but what sort of remedies did Neanderthals use?
In the calculus of a decayed tooth. In a fossil from the Sidron site, Australian researchers found traces of an antibiotic fungus capable of destroying bacteria, as well as traces of willow bark, which is a natural painkiller. Neanderthals had medicinal knowledge for curing the aches and pains that they suffered from. They mastered nature secrets, like witch doctors. So perhaps Neanderthals were confronted with an illness from outside, and to which they weren't able to develop any resistance. A disease from another continent, such as Africa, which Homo sapiens might have brought with them when they migrated to Europe. Could an epidemic have been the cause of the extinction of our protagonists? At Oxford Brookes University in England, Professor Simon Underdown found traces in fossil DNA of infections that Homo sapiens could have transmitted to Neanderthals. Could these diseases carried by Homo sapiens explain the disappearance of our victim? Some of the examples that we've been able to identify by looking at the genetics are the diseases that cause stomach ulcers, some rather nasty parasitic infections, things like hookworm. Also potentially diseases such as genital herpes, and also a possibility tuberculosis might have accompanied Homo sapiens out of Africa.
These would all have been things that the Neanderthals would not have encountered before. Could these infections carried by Homo sapiens explain the disappearance of Neanderthals? One of the problems Neanderthals would have encountered when these diseases started to take hold is it would have had a real impact on population size. Populations have to have a viable number of individuals in order to be able to reproduce. If they don't have that, it starts to knock out those populations, ultimately leading to either localized extinction events or a much wider process of extinction on a continental scale. The narrow genetic diversity of Neanderthals meant a large number of individuals were vulnerable, and the reduced size of their population was a major handicap in fighting infections. Certain illnesses transmitted by sapiens, such as tuberculosis, clearly wreaked havoc on whole clans. Unwittingly, contact with modern humans meant that Neander tribes succumbed to infections. Their population decreased over the course of time. Across the whole continent, the small numbers in the Neanderthal clans pushed them towards extinction. But even if diseases contributed in making our victims more vulnerable, this alone cannot explain the Neanderthals' disappearance. So, was it the ingenuity and creativity of Homo sapiens which hastened the Neanderthals' exit from the path of evolution? During the 5,000 years cohabitation with sapiens in Europe, the last Neander tribes were also developing new ways of doing things. This was proof of their incredible capacity to adapt, even if by that stage it was too late. At Saint-Enchant or at Aries-Jour in Burgundy, Neanderthals crafted ornaments like necklaces made out of the teeth of wolves, foxes, or bears, or out of perfed shells. This was a surprising evolution in their way of life. Out in it, once they came into contact, whether their interactions were positive or negative, exchanges clearly took place. They could have been biological, and they could also have been behavioral, because innovations created by neighbors are always interesting to adopt. From that moment on, these changes spread into the Neanderthal world as well. So, did the Neanderthals also develop their own artistic skills? These knives, discovered at Châtel-Perron in the center of France, are very similar to knives made by sapiens. Are they simply the signs that the Neanderthals and sapiens exchange know-how? Because Neander certainly didn't wait for sapiens to arrive to develop their own aesthetic values. They weren't the stereotypical crude beings insensitive to the beauty of the world. For example, they crafted this fragile rock crystal excavated from Abri and the Doubs at the back of a cave 18,000 years ago in Brunel in the south of France.
They put together unusual stalagmite structures in Jala 40,000 years ago. They carved a mysterious symbolic shape on a rock in the Krapina caves in Croatia. Dava Rabic found amongst the other 13,000-year-old remains claws belonging to 3 different eagles. We noticed that there is 8 claws in the China collection, and we noticed that all of them have some kind of a human-made modification. These traces are the proof that plant fibers or animal tendons were cleverly tied around the eagle's claws. And because there are some modification that indicate that they were somehow rubbed against each other, some kind of polishing on these talons, and we think they were using these claws as some kind of ornaments. The great animals of nature were given meaning and value by archaic man. In Italy and in Spain, the remains that have been found of the wings of golden eagles and black vultures prove that their feathers were used as ornaments. In the imagination of Neanderthals, these large birds of prey weren't just ordinary birds. Neanderthal art expressed itself in many ways. They wore trinkets made out of shells, they used ochre and manganese pigments to decorate their bodies, and they wore animal skins and other objects. Well before the arrival of sapiens in Europe, these humans knew perfectly well how to create aesthetically pleasing things. They were the first exponents of prehistoric drawings. At Hopesa in the center of France, Neanderthals used their fingers to paint on the cave walls. They carved out this stone and inserted a piece of bone to make a face. These flashes of Neanderthal creativity paved the way for the great artistic works of sapiens to come. Neanderthals and sapiens exchanged their know-how, but did they go further than that? Did they have intimate relationships which produced children? And did these children of mixed species themselves have descendants? In 2010, Professor Santipabo and his team pulled off the amazing feat of deciphering the genetic sequences found in Neanderthal remains in the Vindija cave in Croatia. Thanks to the progress of molecular biology, these scientists at Max Planck in Leipzig sequenced this 47,000-year-old DNA. What these tests highlighted is that Neanderthal DNA is as close as 98.5% to our own. So, is it the blood that runs in our veins that can help solve some of the mystery surrounding the disappearance of Neanderthals? Scientists now have a vital piece of evidence at their disposal. Neanderthals and sapiens share more or less the same genome. So it's entirely possible that the union of these two species could have happened. And in order to confirm this theory, scientists compared the genes of Europeans, Asians, Africans, Oceanians, and Americans with those of Neanderthals. The whole world was staggered by their conclusions. What we found when we first sequenced the first Neanderthal genome was that people that live outside of Africa today all carry small amounts of the Neanderthal genome in the range of 2%. Of all people outside of Africa come from interbreeding with Neanderthals. And we estimate that that happened somewhere between 50 and 70,000 years ago. Neanderthals and sapiens had coupled together. Since African populations did not inherit Neanderthal genes, this interbreeding took place in the Middle East or in Eurasia. Genetic research has proved that Nile blood runs in our veins. All we need is the archaeological proof. In the spring of 2002, at Pesacuaz, in the heart of a Romanian forest, a team of scientists entered a small cave into which a river disappeared. In one of these deep galleries, the researchers dug up human remains. After tests, they turned out to be fossils of Homo sapiens. The first thing we found was a jawbone, which we called OAS1, and it turned out to be the jawbone of a sapiens. We then found remains from at least 2 other individuals. One had a skull, which was almost completely intact. Not the other one. We were able to carbonate these fossils. These Homo sapiens fossils came from the first modern humans to have crossed over into Europe. They date back 42,000 years. Fortunately, and this is what's so wonderful about the discovery, we were able not only to carbonate the fossils, but we were also able to test the DNA. These tests showed that part of this sapiens fossil's genome came from Neanderthals. This Homo sapiens had around 6% of Neanderthal DNA, which is much higher than in humans today. This implies that this individual had a Neanderthal ancestor going back 8 generations, or no more than 200 years. But this is not the oldest proof of interbreeding. DNA samples from Siberian Neanderthals have shown other evidence of hybridization. The Neanderthals in Denisova contain several genetic markers of modern-day humans that European Neals, for example, don't have. So it's likely that there was an influx of genes from modern-day humans to the Neanderthals in Denisova, either from the Middle East or from Africa. These genetic clues confirm that Neanderthals and sapiens first came into contact with each other around 120,000 years ago in the Middle East, as sapiens migrated from Africa. The fossil remains in Romania and in Siberia prove that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens coupled during at least two periods in the course of history. Once around 120,000 years ago, and a second time around 60,000 years later. These two periods of genetic intermingling took place in the Middle East and in Central Asia. Neanderthals transmitted a part of their genome outside of Africa. Every human possesses about 2% of Neanderthal genes, and they're never the same ones. Put all together, there is more than 30% of Neander genetic material which lives on in us. So, what is the genetic material that we inherited? Fair skins, which we see in Asia and Europe, are genetic elements that come from the Neanderthals. There are also genetic elements in our immune systems which come from them. So geneticists have uncovered a vital gene in our defense system passed down by Neanderthals. It helps to fight infections, and it's called the HLA gene. Neanderthals have helped us to protect against illnesses. Humans carry a lot of variation in their genomes, and some of that variation comes from the Neanderthals. And some of it is positive, and some of it is negative. So we have owls from Neanderthals that protect us against some diseases, and we have owls from Neanderthals that increase our risk for some diseases. For example, our risk of type 2 diabetes is increased by a Neanderthal variant. The process of analyzing the Andal inheritance is far from over. Genomics, the science of sequencing and mapping genomes, is only just beginning to give us an overall view of what our ancestors have passed down to us. This genetic input is like a memory of our past, the history of our species, and also the history of the encounter between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. The fact that all people outside of Africa have a small proportion of Neanderthal DNA floating around in our genome, this really makes us question how far the Neanderthals have really become extinct. We can clearly say that they disappeared as a living, breathing species, but the fact that genes survive inside of us really poses some quite interesting questions about what extinction does and does not mean. Those Neanderthals who chose to interbreed and share with sapiens have passed on a precious legacy to us. We accumulate new genetic variation driven by changes in our environment, and we also gather new genetic variation by interbreeding with closely related groups like the Neals. I think no one had thought that that was a very important feature in human evolution. Both modern-day humans and Neanderthals have a common heritage, and even if they're no longer around as a related species, the memories of the journey that we made together live on. I don't make a sharp distinction between the under and modern human. Those are two hominine groups, and I tend to put them together. It's not just we are carrying a certain amount of Neanderthal gene. In a way, we are all Neander, as we are all more than human. The Neanderthals, our human siblings. Children of Africa and of Europe, O prehistoric athletes, skilled hunters, pioneering artists, and outstanding craftspeople, inventors and ingenious engineers, tireless travelers exploring their limits, healers, doctors, and herbalists, carers of children, families, and clans to the end of their days. Their heritage goes beyond the genes that they passed down to us. No one killed off the Neanderthals. Neanderthals live on in us.